My husband didn't believe me, but the African boy wouldn't leave me alone. I used to think loneliness was the worst feeling in the world, but I was wrong. There's something far worse, being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. That was my life. Every morning, I woke up to the same routine. I made breakfast for a husband who barely looked at me, cleaned a house that felt more like a prison, and spent my days staring out the window, watching the world move while I stood still. It hadn't always been this way. Once, my husband and I laughed together, talked for hours, and held each other like we never wanted to let go. But over time, the space between us grew wider, and I stopped trying to close the gap. I had accepted that I was alone, even when he was right beside me. Then, one evening, everything changed. My husband came home with news, something that shattered the dull, predictable rhythm of my life. "There's someone coming to stay with us," he said casually over dinner, barely glancing up from his plate. "His name is Emmanuel." I blinked, caught off guard. Emmanuel? Who was that? My husband barely explained, just that he was the son of an old friend who had passed away. "He needs a place to stay for a while," he added, as if it was nothing, as if it didn't matter how I felt. And just like that, it was decided. The next afternoon, when I opened the door, Emmanuel stood there, tall and quiet, his dark eyes locking onto mine. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, something I couldn't quite place. I didn't know it yet, but from that moment on, I would never feel alone again. Not for a single second. I stepped aside to let Emmanuel in, forcing a polite smile. He walked past me slowly, his eyes scanning the house as if he was memorizing every detail. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, with sharp features and a quiet, unreadable expression. My husband greeted him with a firm handshake and a few words, but I noticed something strange. Emmanuel barely looked at him. Instead, his gaze kept shifting back to me. It wasn't the kind of look that made me uncomfortable, but there was something intense about it, something I couldn't explain. That evening, as I set the table for dinner, I tried to remind myself that Emmanuel was just a guest. He had lost his family and he needed a place to stay. That was all. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was different. Unlike my husband, who barely noticed me anymore, Emmanuel seemed hyper-aware of everything I did. The way his eyes followed me as I moved around the kitchen. The way he sat silently at the table, never speaking unless spoken to. My husband didn't seem to notice, too focused on his own thoughts. But I felt it, and I didn't know why, but it made my heart beat just a little faster. Later that night, after I cleaned up the kitchen, I went to our bedroom, expecting my husband to at least ask how I was feeling about our unexpected guest. But he was already lying in bed, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I sighed, turning off the light and lying down beside him, but my mind was restless. I replayed the way Emmanuel had looked at me, the way he seemed so still, so quiet, yet so present. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. As I walked into the living room, I stopped in my tracks. Emmanuel was already there, sitting on the couch, staring at the window. He didn't turn when I entered, but I knew he heard me. The air in the room felt heavy, like something unspoken was hanging between us. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting mine. Then, with a small, almost knowing smile, he finally spoke. "I dreamed about you," he said softly. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know why, but in that moment a chill ran down my spine. I forced a small laugh, pretending his words didn't shake me. "Oh? What kind of dream?" I asked, keeping my tone light, but inside I was holding my breath. Emmanuel tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to tell me. "It was peaceful, he said finally. We were standing in a place I used to know back home. There was a river, and the wind was warm. He paused, his eyes locked onto mine. You looked happy. I didn't know how to respond to that. My hands tightened around the coffee mug I was holding, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe he was just being friendly. Maybe he was lonely, searching for some kind of connection. But still, something about the way he said it, the way he looked at me, it unsettled me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. My husband left for work without much conversation, and Emmanuel stayed behind, sitting quietly in the living room as if he had no place else to be. I went about my chores, trying to ignore the weight of his presence, but I could feel his eyes on me whenever I passed by. Then, just as I started folding laundry in the bedroom, I heard his voice from the doorway. Do you love him? I froze. My hands gripped the soft fabric of a shirt, my mind scrambling for the right response. I turned slowly, finding him standing there, his expression unreadable. That's not something you ask, I said, my voice steady, but my heart pounding. He nodded slightly, as if he already knew what my answer would be. You don't, he murmured. Something about the way he said it made me defensive. That's not true. He took a slow step forward, his gaze still locked onto mine. Then why do you seem so sad? I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know how he saw it, how he knew something even my husband didn't seem to notice. My marriage wasn't falling apart. Not exactly, but it had lost its warmth, its meaning. And somehow, this young man, this stranger, had seen through everything. I turned away, forcing a laugh. You're imagining things, Emmanuel. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence between us spoke louder than any words. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband's soft snores filling the room. I should have felt safe beside him, but my mind kept drifting back to Emmanuel, his words, his gaze, the quiet way he seemed to know things I hadn't even admitted to myself. I turned to my husband, watching the peaceful rise and fall of his chest. He had always been kind, always steady, but somewhere along the way, the warmth between us had faded into routine. I closed my eyes, trying to shake the thoughts away, but just as I began to drift off, a noise startled me, a faint knock. My heart pounded as I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I held my breath, listening, hoping I had imagined it. But then, another knock. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my husband. The air felt heavier with each step I took toward the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, hesitating. I didn't need to look through the peephole. I already knew who it was. I cracked the door open just enough to see outside. Emmanuel stood there, his face half hidden in the shadows. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a shiver down my spine. You shouldn't be here, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't move. I had to see you. A strange mix of fear and curiosity twisted inside me. Why? He took a slow breath. Because you're not safe. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder, making sure my husband was still asleep. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice more urgent now. He hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper. I remember now. Why I know you. Why I dream about you. His dark eyes locked onto mine, intense and unshaken. And why I can't leave you alone. My breath caught in my throat. The air between us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. What do you mean? I asked, my fingers tightening on the doorframe. His answer sent a shock through my entire body. Because you saved me once. The world around me seemed to tilt. I felt dizzy, unsteady. What? But before he could explain, a sudden noise from inside made me jump. My husband was waking up, and in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. Panic surged through me as I turned back toward the bedroom. My husband stirred, his body shifting under the covers. If he woke up and saw Emmanuel standing there, I had no idea how I would explain it. I looked back at Emmanuel, his face shadowed in the dim light of the hallway. You have to go, I whispered, urgency tightening my voice. But he didn't move. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and firm. This is important. I shook my head, glancing back inside. My husband let out a sigh, still half asleep, turning onto his side. I exhaled in relief. There was still time, but not much. Please, I said, stepping outside just enough to pull the door closed behind me. The night air was cold against my skin. I don't understand what you're saying. What do you mean I saved you? Emmanuel swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving mine. When I was a boy, I was lost, alone. It was you. You found me. I felt the ground shift beneath me. That's impossible, I whispered. I've never been to Africa. His jaw clenched. Not in this life, he said, his words sending a chill down my spine. I took a step back, my breath shallow. What are you saying? He hesitated, searching my face. I know how it sounds, but I remember you. Your voice, your face. I was just a child, but you were there. You saved me from something terrible. And now I think it's happening again. A strange sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. But deep inside, something about his words rang familiar, like a distant echo of a memory I couldn't reach. I opened my mouth to respond, but suddenly the door behind me creaked open. My heart stopped. My husband stood in the doorway, eyes groggy with sleep, but quickly sharpening with confusion as he took in the sight before him. His gaze shifted from me to Emmanuel, and I could see the questions forming in his mind. Who is this? His voice was rough with sleep, but there was an edge to it. I stepped back inside instinctively, forcing a nervous smile. It's... Before I could finish, Emmanuel cut in. I was just leaving. He shot me one last look, one filled with urgency, warning, before turning and walking away. I watched him disappear into the night, my heart pounding. My husband's eyes narrowed. Why was he here? What's going on? I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling for an answer. It's nothing, just someone I met earlier. He needed help. My husband studied me, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a sigh. Come inside, he said, stepping back. I nodded, stepping past him, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Emmanuel had come for a reason, and whatever he was trying to tell me, whatever he believed was coming, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The night felt heavier than before, like something unseen was pressing against me. My husband went back to bed, but sleep refused to come to me. Emmanuel's words kept circling in my mind. You saved me before. It's happening again. I didn't understand what he meant, but the weight of his gaze, the desperation in his voice, it wasn't something I could ignore. I needed answers. The next morning, I searched for Emmanuel. I went back to the cafe where I first saw him, but he wasn't there. I wandered the streets, scanning every face, every alley. My pulse quickened with every empty corner, every unanswered question. Just when I was about to give up, I saw him, standing at the edge of a quiet street watching me. I hurried over. Tell me everything, I said, my voice firm, my heart pounding. He hesitated, then nodded. Not here, come with me. I followed him, every step heavy with uncertainty. He led me to a small, abandoned-looking house. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else, something ancient, something unspoken. He pulled out a small, worn out book from his bag and handed it to me. My fingers trembled as I opened it. My breath caught. The pages were old, filled with handwritten notes in a language I didn't recognize, until I turned to the middle. There, drawn in faded ink, was a sketch of a woman. My stomach dropped. It was me. I looked up, my hands shaking. What is this? Emmanuel's voice was barely a whisper. This book belongs to my family. It tells the story of a woman who once saved a lost boy from something dark. A woman who promised she would always protect him, no matter when, no matter where. I felt dizzy, my mind racing. That's not possible. I don't remember this. You don't have to, Emmanuel said. But it remembers you. Suddenly, the air shifted. A deep, unsettling cold wrapped around us. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally. Emmanuel's grip tightened on my wrist. It's here. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it too. A presence, something watching, waiting. The air crackled like a silent storm. My chest tightened as a whisper echoed through the room, calling my name. And then, just as suddenly as it came, everything went dark. The light that had once seemed so foreign now felt like part of me, pulsing with a quiet power I couldn't fully understand, but knew I had to embrace. Emmanuel stood beside me, his presence steady, yet his eyes held a flicker of doubt. I could see that he was searching for something, some sign that this would all be over. But the shadows in the corners of the room, though weakened, weren't gone. The fight wasn't over yet. We can't let our guard down, I said, my voice steady but filled with a gravity I hadn't known I could carry. It's still here. It's not finished. Emmanuel nodded, his expression somber. You're right, but the truth is, we've done what we came here to do. We've stopped it from taking you. But not from returning, I whispered, my thoughts racing. I can't let that happen again. I have to understand more. This promise, this power, it's mine, but it's bigger than me. I need to know who I really am. Emmanuel took a deep breath, clearly hesitant. But then, with a sigh, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. You don't remember everything, but I do. I remember the stories, the warnings, the power passed down through generations. You were always meant to be the one who could stop it, the one who could protect. I swallowed, trying to make sense of it all. But I didn't know. I didn't remember. You didn't have to, Emmanuel replied softly. The truth was waiting for you to see it. You were always meant to find your strength when the time came. As I stood there, the weight of the words settled over me. I wasn't just a woman trying to make sense of her life. I was the protector, the one destined to face darkness head on, even when it felt overwhelming. And while I may not have known the full story, I understood now what I had to do. The promise was mine to keep, not just for Emmanuel, but for everyone the shadows threatened. I turned to leave the abandoned house, the first rays of daylight spilling through the cracks in the walls. Emmanuel walked beside me, and as we stepped into the sunlight, I knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be mine to face, and I would face it with everything I had. We had stopped the darkness for now, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a chance for me to remember, to grow, and to protect once again. The power was in my hands, and I would not let it slip away. This time, I would be ready,